When basketball legend Michael Jordan sits next to a talented blind teenager at a public piano in Chicago's Millennium Park, neither realizes their chance encounter will change both their lives forever. As Jordan helps young Marlon Thompson pursue his musical dreams, a mysterious connection from the past gradually emerges. One that will leave everyone in tears when finally revealed. Marlon Thompson's fingers danced across the piano keys in Millennium Park. The cool autumn breeze tickled his face as he played. Even though Marlon couldn't see the people walking by, he could hear their footsteps, their whispers, and the occasional clink of coins dropping into his jar. "Thank you," Marlon said with a smile, nodding in the direction of the sound. He was 14 years old and had been playing the piano since he was 5. His mom always said he had a gift. Marlon adjusted his dark sunglasses and continued playing a jazz tune he had learned last week. The public piano wasn't the best. Some keys stuck and others were slightly out of tune. But Marlon didn't mind. It was better than not playing at all. The afternoon had started sunny, but Marlon could sense the change in the air. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. People walked faster, their footsteps more hurried. Soon, he felt the first drops on his hands. "Great," Marlon mumbled. He'd have to pack up soon. Rain wasn't good for the piano, and his mom would worry if he got soaked, just as he was about to stop. He heard heavy footsteps approach and pause right beside the piano. The footsteps sounded different, confident and measured. Marlon continued playing, finishing the song with a flourish. "That was pretty good," said a deep, calm voice. Marlon nodded. "Thanks, I try." The stranger didn't walk away like most people did after dropping a coin or offering a compliment. Instead, Marlon felt the bench shift as someone sat down next to him. The man smelled like expensive cologne and freshly laundered clothes. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" the deep voice asked. "It's starting to rain, and I've got some time to kill." "Sure," Marlon replied. "The piano's for everyone." The rain began to fall harder, pattering on the protective awning above the piano. The park grew quieter as people scurried away to find shelter. "You know, Fly Me to the Moon?" the stranger asked. Marlon grinned. "One of my favorites." He positioned his fingers and began to play the classic tune. To his surprise, the stranger hummed along perfectly, his deep voice matching the melody with perfect pitch. When Marlon added some extra flourishes to the bridge, the man chuckled appreciatively. "Nice touch," he said. They finished the song together, and for a moment just sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rain. "I'm Mike," the stranger finally said. "Marlon Thompson," Marlon replied, extending his hand in the direction of the voice. A large, warm hand engulfed his in a gentle handshake. "You've got real talent, kid," Mike said. "How long have you been playing?" "Since I was 5, Marlon answered. "My dad started teaching me before." He stopped, not wanting to share too much with a stranger. "Before what?" Mike asked gently. Something about Mike's voice made Marlon feel safe. "Before he died," Marlon finished. "He was a musician too, and blind, like me. He taught me that music helps me see the world. Each note is like a color or a feeling." "That's beautiful," Mike said, his voice thoughtful. "My father used to say something similar about basketball, that it wasn't just about putting a ball through a hoop. It was about finding your rhythm." "You play basketball?" Marlon asked. Mike chuckled. "A little bit." The rain continued to fall, creating a soft backdrop to their conversation. Mike asked Marlon about school, about his favorite musicians, about his dreams. Unlike most adults, Mike actually listened to his answers. "So what brings you to the park on a rainy day?" Marlon asked. "Sometimes I need to clear my head," Mike replied. "People always want something from me. But when I'm just walking around, being normal, It helps me remember who I really am." Marlon nodded. He understood that feeling, even at 14. People often treated him differently because of his blindness, either with pity or awkward curiosity. "Play something else for me," Mike requested. "Whatever you're working on right now." Marlon hesitated. "It's not perfect yet." "Nothing worth doing ever starts out perfect," Mike said. Marlon positioned his hands and began playing a complicated jazz piece he'd been practicing for weeks. He messed up a few notes in the middle and winced. "Sorry," he mumbled. "Don't apologize," Mike said firmly. "Just keep going." Marlon continued, finding his rhythm again. When he finished, Mike clapped. "That's some serious skill," Mike said. "Where do you usually play?" "Here, mostly. Sometimes at school. My mom saved up for a keyboard at home, but it's not the same as a real piano." "You take lessons?" Marlon shook his head. "We can't afford them anymore. My mom works 2 jobs just to keep our apartment." He hadn't meant to share that much, but something about Mike made it easy to talk. They sat together for nearly an hour as the rain fell. Mike never mentioned that he was famous or important. He was just a kind man who appreciated music and seemed interested in Marlon's life. As the rain began to let up, Mike stood. Marlon could tell he was tall from the way his voice came from above. "I should get going," Mike said. "But I enjoyed this, Marlon. You've got something special." "Thanks," Marlon replied, feeling his cheeks warm at the compliment. "Will you be here tomorrow?" Mike asked. The question surprised Marlon. "Probably. I come most days after school, around 3. Maybe I'll stop by again," Mike said. Marlon heard him reach into his pocket. Something dropped into Marlon's jar with a heavy clink, heavier than the usual coins. Before Marlon could thank him, another voice called from a distance. "Sir, the car is waiting." "Be right there," Mike called back. Then, quieter, to Marlon. "See you around, piano man." Marlon listened to the footsteps fade away. Curious, he reached into his jar and felt around until his fingers touched something that wasn't a coin. He pulled out what felt like a business card. He'd have to ask his mom to read it to him later. As Marlon packed up his things, he couldn't help smiling. Something about Mike's kind interest had brightened his day more than any amount of money in his jar could. For the first time in a long while, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow. What Marlon didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that Mike had stopped at the edge of the park, looking back at the young pianist with thoughtful eyes. The tall man nodded to himself before sliding into a sleek black car, where a driver closed the door behind him. "Where to, Mr. Jordan?" the driver asked. "Home," Michael Jordan replied, his mind still on the talented blind boy and his music. "And make a call to my assistant. I need to find out more about piano lessons." The rain had stopped completely now, and rays of sunshine broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the park where Marlon Thompson had just played the best afternoon concert of his young life. The next day, Marlon arrived at the IEBE park earlier than usual. He couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Mike. The business card his mother had read to him last night only said MJ, with a phone number, no company name or title. "Probably just some nice man who enjoys music," his mother had said, though she sounded skeptical. "Be careful, Marlon. Not everyone has good intentions." Marlon nodded, but secretly hoped Mike would return. There was something special about their conversation, like Mike truly saw him as a musician, not just as a blind kid. The afternoon sun warmed Marlon's face as he settled at the piano. He played through his usual pieces, pausing occasionally to listen for those distinctive footsteps. After an hour, his hope began to fade. "Silly," he muttered to himself. Why would someone important come back? Just as he was about to start packing up, he heard them. Those same confident, measured footsteps. His heart leaped. "You're still here," Mike's deep voice said. "Good. I brought something." Marlon felt the bench shift as Mike sat beside him. A warm cardboard cup was placed gently in his hands. "Hot chocolate," Mike explained, "with extra marshmallows. It's getting chilly out here." "Thanks," Marlon said, surprised by the thoughtful gesture. He took a careful sip, savoring the rich sweetness. "It's perfect." "I think I promised you some music," Mike said. "But first, how was school today?" They talked easily, like old friends. Mike asked questions about Marlon's classes, his friends, and especially about his music. Unlike most adults, Mike didn't speak to him in that overly patient, slightly loud voice people often used with blind people. He spoke normally, with genuine interest. "So," Mike said, after Marlon finished describing his music teacher at school, "what's the big dream? If you could do anything with your music, what would it be?" Marlon hesitated. He rarely shared his deepest dreams with anyone. Even his mother only heard the practical versions. "You can tell me," Mike encouraged. "No judgment here." Marlon took a deep breath. "I want to play at the Chicago Symphony Hall someday," he admitted shyly. "But blind. Kids from the South Side don't get those chances." Mike was quiet for a moment. Marlon worried he'd said too much. "Who told you that?" Mike finally asked, his voice serious. "Nobody needs to tell me," Marlon replied. "It's just how things are." Mike mused. "You know, people used to say that kids from North Carolina couldn't become the greatest basketball players, that we weren't tall enough or quick enough." "What happened to those kids?" Marlon asked. Mike laughed softly. "Some of them proved everyone wrong." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Mike spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "What if I could help you get an audition?" Marlon laughed, thinking it was a joke. "Sure, and pigs will fly." "I'm serious," Mike said. "I know some people, but you'd have to practice harder than ever before." Marlon felt his heart racing. Was this really happening? "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "Because someone once took a chance on me," Mike answered simply, "and everyone deserves their shot." "But," Marlon struggled to find the right words. "What's the catch?" "No catch, just hard work. Very hard work." Marlon's fingers trembled, slightly as they rested on the piano keys. Could he really trust this stranger? But something in Mike's voice, a quiet confidence, an honest directness, made Marlon want to believe. "Okay," Marlon said finally. "If you're serious, I'm willing to work harder than anyone." "That's what I wanted to hear," Mike said, and Marlon could hear the smile in his voice. "Let me make some calls. I'll be in touch." As Mike stood to leave, he placed something on top of the piano. "My private number. Have your mom call me tonight, so she knows this is legitimate." Marlon nodded, excitement bubbling up inside him. "I will." "Play me out with something hopeful," Mike requested. Marlon thought for a moment, then placed his fingers on the keys. He played "What a Wonderful World," pouring all his new hope into every note. As the last notes faded, he heard Mike's footsteps begin to retreat. Then they paused. "You've got magic in those hands, Marlon Thompson," Mike called back. "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do." The footsteps resumed, growing fainter until they disappeared among the park sounds. Marlon sat still, trying to process what had just happened. Was this real, or some elaborate joke? He was still sitting there, lost in thought, when another set of footsteps approached. Lighter. Quicker. "Excuse me," a woman's voice said. I couldn't help noticing. Was that who I think it was? Who? Marlon asked, confused. The man you were talking to, she continued, her voice excited. Tall guy, baseball cap, expensive sneakers. His name is Mike, Marlon offered. The woman laughed, in disbelief. Do you know who that was? That was Michael Jordan! Marlon froze, not believing her. The Michael Jordan? The greatest basketball player ever? It couldn't be. You're mistaken, he said, shaking his head. Why would Michael Jordan talk to me? I'm a Bulls season ticket holder, the woman insisted. I'd recognize him anywhere. That was definitely him. After she left, Marlon carefully packed up his things, his mind racing. It couldn't be true. Why would someone like Michael Jordan spend time with a nobody like him? Yet, something about Mike had felt special from the beginning. That quiet confidence, the way he spoke about proving people wrong. That night, Marlon sat nervously as his mother dialed the number Mike had given them. Hello, she said hesitantly. My son Marlon met someone today who gave him this number. Her eyes widened suddenly. Mr. Jordan? The basketball player? Marlon's heart pounded as he listened to his mother's side of the conversation. Yes, he's very talented. No formal training recently. That's very generous. But why would you? There was a long pause as she listened. I see, she said finally, her voice softer. Yes, I think I understand. When she hung up, she looked at Marlon with wonder in her eyes. Well, he asked, barely able to contain himself. It seems, she said slowly, that Michael Jordan believes in you. Marlon smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. Someone believed in him. Not just anyone, but a legend who knew what it meant to overcome obstacles and defy expectations. Tomorrow would be the first day of his new journey. He couldn't wait to see where it would lead. Marlon woke before his alarm, too excited to sleep. Today was the day. The first step toward a dream he'd barely allowed himself to have. Marlon, you up already? His mother called from the Kit Rossi of their small apartment. Elena Thompson worked night shifts at the hospital and morning shifts at a coffee shop. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, but she smiled as she set a bowl of oatmeal on their wobbly table. Couldn't sleep, Marlon admitted, feeling his way to his chair. Nervous? She asked, gently touching his shoulder. What if this is some kind of joke? Marlon whispered, voicing the fear that had crept in overnight. Elena sighed. I thought the same thing. But that was really him on the phone, Marlon. And he seemed genuine. A knock at the door made them both jump. Elena checked the peephole, then gasped. What is it? Marlon asked. There's a man in a suit outside, with a car. The man introduced himself as David Crenshaw, personal assistant to Mr. Jordan. He handed Elena a folder of papers. Mr. Jordan has arranged for Marlon to join a specialized music program, he explained. All the details are here, including transportation arrangements and scheduled lessons. Elena flipped through the papers suspiciously. This seems too good to be true. Mr. Jordan is a generous man who values talent and determination, David replied. He sometimes prefers to keep his charitable actions private. While his mother reviewed the papers, Marlon's mind raced. This was really happening, but doubt still nagged at him. Why would someone like Michael Jordan care about a random blind kid from the South Side? His mother's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Hello? Yes, this is Elena Thompson. She paused. Mr. Jordan. Yes, your assistant is here now. Another pause. That's very generous, but... Marlon listened as his mother asked careful questions about the program, the teachers, and the expectations. By the time she hung up, her voice had softened. "He says this is no charity case," she told Marlon. "He says you have real talent that deserves nurturing." 2 hours later, Marlon found himself in a sleek car heading to his first lesson. Yudirham, leather seats felt smooth under his fingers, nicer than anything he'd ever touched. "We're here, Marlon," David announced as the car stopped. "The Chicago Music Academy." Marlon had heard of this place. It was where wealthy kids with musical talents went for advanced training. His heart pounded as David guided him inside. The building smelled of polished wood and something else: possibility. His footsteps echoed in what must have been a large hall. "Marlon Thompson?" A woman's voice, crisp and accented, approached them. "I am Abigail Rosie. You may call me Ms. Rosie." Her handshake was firm. Marlon noticed she didn't hesitate or treat him differently because of his blindness. "Mr. Jordan speaks highly of your natural abilities," she said. "But talent is merely the foundation. Are you prepared to work harder than you ever have before?" "Yes, ma'am," Marlon replied, standing straighter. "Good. Then we shall begin." Ms. Rosie led Marlon to a practice room containing a grand piano that made his fingers tingle with anticipation. "Play for me," she instructed. "Whatever you consider your best piece." Marlon took a deep breath and began playing a jazz piece his father had taught him. It had always impressed people at the park. "Stop," Ms. Rosie said after 30 seconds. "Your technique is undisciplined. Your timing is erratic. Your posture is terrible." Marlon's cheeks burned with embarrassment. "However," she continued, her voice softening slightly, "your musicality is exceptional. Your emotional connection to the music is rare." For the next 2 hours, Ms. Rosie corrected everything about Marlon's playing: his hand position, his breathing, his fingering technique. By the end, his fingers ached and his head swam with new information. "You will practice these exercises for 2 hours daily," Ms. Rosie said, recording patterns for him to take home. "We will meet 3 times weekly." "Yes, ma'am," Marlon said, his fingers still tingling from the intensive session. As David drove him home, Marlon flexed his sore fingers. "That was the hardest lesson I've ever had," he admitted. "Mr. Jordan warned you it wouldn't be easy," David replied, "but he believes you're up to the challenge." The next few weeks established a grueling routine. Marlon attended school, practiced Ms. Rosie's exercises religiously, and returned to the academy for lessons that left him mentally and physically exhausted. Some days, he wanted to quit. The technical exercises seemed impossible to master. His fingers cramped, and frustration brought tears to his eyes more than once. "Music isn't just about playing notes," Ms. Rosie told him during a particularly difficult session. "It's about feeling them in your soul. But first, your technique must become second nature." One afternoon during his 3rd week of training, Marlon recognized those familiar footsteps entering the practice room. "How's it going, piano man?" Jordan's deep voice asked. "Mr. Jordan?" Marlon exclaimed, then quickly corrected himself. "I mean, Mike." Jordan chuckled. "Mike is fine. Ms. Rosie tells me you're working hard." "It's harder than I expected," Marlon admitted. "Everything worth achieving is," Jordan replied, sitting beside him on the bench. "You know, when I first started training with the Bulls, I thought I'd collapse from exhaustion." "Really? Even you?" "Especially me. I wanted it so badly that I pushed myself beyond what the coaches required. My muscles screamed. Some nights I could barely climb the stairs to my apartment." Marlon nodded, understanding exactly what Jordan meant. "But here's the secret," Jordan continued. One day, you realize the pain has transformed into strength. The impossible becomes possible. Then, eventually, it becomes easy. "When does that happen?" Marlon asked hopefully. Jordan laughed. "I'll let you know when I figure that out. Some things always stay challenging. That's what keeps us growing." Before leaving, Jordan asked Marlon to play something. Despite his aching fingers, Marlon performed one of his new pieces. It wasn't perfect, but it was cleaner and more technically precise than anything he'd played before. "You're improving already," Jordan observed. "Keep pushing." As weeks turned into months, Marlon developed calluses on his fingers and a resilience in his spirit. Ms. Rosie's criticism became less frequent, occasionally even replaced with brief comments of approval. The keyboard Jordan had sent to Marlon's apartment allowed him to practice at home. Some nights, Elena would sit quietly listening as her son played increasingly complex pieces with growing confidence. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered one evening, her voice catching. Marlon nodded, his heart full. His father had always believed music was in their blood, a gift passed down through generations. Now, with proper training, Marlon felt closer to his father than ever before. During one of Jordan's visits, he shared stories about his own training challenges, how his high school coach initially cut him from the team, how he'd practiced shooting in his backyard until his mother called him in for dinner, then continued practicing by moonlight. "Persistence," Jordan said simply. "That's the difference between good and great." After 3 months of intensive training, Ms. Rosie announced that Marlon was ready to begin preparing for real performances. "You've built a foundation," she told him. "Now, we build the house." That evening, as David drove him home, Marlon reflected on how much had changed. His playing had improved dramatically. He'd developed discipline he never knew he possessed. And somehow, miraculously, Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player who ever lived, had become his mentor and friend. What hadn't changed was the question that still nagged at him. Why had Jordan chosen him? What had he seen in a blind kid playing piano in the park that day? Marlon didn't know the answer yet, but as his fingers absently tapped out rhythms on his knees, he made a silent promise. Whatever Jordan's reason, Marlon would prove himself worthy of this chance. 3 months into training, Marlon hit a wall. The piece Ms. Rosie wanted him to master, Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu, demanded technical skills that seemed beyond his reach. His fingers fumbled over the complex passages, and frustration mounted with each failed attempt. "Again," Ms. Rosie said, after Marlon botched the middle section for the 8th time that afternoon. "Your left hand is not keeping proper time." Marlon tried once more, but his fingers felt like lead weights. When he stumbled over the same passage, he slammed his hands down on the keys. "I can't do it," he said, breathing hard. "It's too difficult." Ms. Rosie was silent for a moment. "Perhaps we should end early today," she finally said. "Your mind is working against you." On the ride home, Marlon sat in dejected silence. David, usually chatty, seemed to sense his mood and didn't push conversation. When they arrived at his apartment, Marlon was surprised to hear David say, "Mr. Jordan is waiting upstairs. He wanted to check on your progress." Great, Marlon thought. Now I have to tell Michael Jordan I'm failing. Jordan was sitting at their small Kit Rossi table when Marlon entered. The familiar smell of his cologne filled the tiny apartment. "Hey, piano man," Jordan greeted him. "Rough day?" Something about Jordan's gentle tone broke Marlon's composure. "I can't do it," he blurted out. "I've tried and tried, but the piece is impossible. Ms. Rosie probably thinks I'm wasting her time." He swallowed hard. I'm thinking of quitting. The silence that followed felt heavy. Marlon heard Jordan shift in his chair. "Let's take a walk," Jordan finally said. 10 minutes later, they were strolling through a quiet neighborhood park. The evening air was cool against Marlon's skin. "When I was your age," Jordan began, "basketball wasn't just a game to me. It was my connection to something bigger than myself." Marlon nodded, wondering where this was going. "What I've never told many people," Jordan continued, his voice softer now, "was how much basketball meant after my father died." Marlon's breath caught. He hadn't known Jordan had lost his father, too. "It happened when I was in college," Jordan explained. "My dad was my biggest supporter, my best friend. When I lost him, I nearly lost myself." They walked in silence for a few steps. "Basketball became both my escape and my connection to him," Jordan continued. "When I played, I could almost hear his voice cheering me on. But there were days, many days, when the pain made it impossible to focus, when I wanted to walk away from everything." "What did you do?" Marlon asked quietly. "I asked myself a question," Jordan replied. "What's your music connected to, Marlon?" The question caught Marlon off guard. He thought for a moment, then answered truthfully. "My dad. He was also a musician who lost his sight. But unlike me, he was born with vision and lost it later, in a car accident." "The same accident that took his life?" Jordan asked gently. Marlon nodded, surprised Jordan had guessed. "I was 6. The car flipped over a guardrail. Dad died instantly. I was in the back seat. That's why I survived. But glass fragments damaged my eyes beyond repair." "I'm sorry," Jordan said, his hand resting briefly on Marlon's shoulder. "Before the accident, Dad was teaching me piano. After I lost my sight, music became my way of seeing, of connecting with him. Then play for him," Jordan said simply. "And for yourself." They continued walking, the evening sounds enveloping them. "You know," Jordan said after a while, "there's this myth that I never struggled with basketball. That success came easily, didn't it?" Marlon asked. "You're the greatest ever." Jordan chuckled. "During my second season with the Bulls, I broke my foot. Had to sit out for months. The team wanted me to miss the entire season, but I fought to come back. When I did, I wasn't the same player. My timing was off. My confidence was shaken." "What happened?" "I worked harder," Jordan said simply. "I adjusted my technique. I learned to play with the limitations until they weren't limitations anymore." He paused. "This piece you're struggling with, maybe you're approaching it wrong. Maybe there's another way to master it." As they walked back toward the apartment, Jordan added, "Everyone hits walls, Marlon. The great ones find ways through them, over them, or around them. But they never, ever turn back." That night, after Jordan left, Marlon sat at his keyboard with new determination. Instead of attacking the difficult passage at full speed, he broke it down into tiny sections. He practiced each hand separately, at a glacial pace, until the muscle memory began to form. What Marlon couldn't know was that Jordan had his own hidden reason for helping him, a connection to Marlon's father that went deeper than Jordan had revealed. As Jordan drove home that night, his mind drifted back to a small jazz club on Chicago's South Side years ago, where a blind pianist had played with such soul that it had moved Jordan to tears during a particularly dark time in his life. Suntiu, pianist's name had been Ray Thompson, a detail Jordan was keeping to himself until the right moment. The next morning, Marlon arrived early for his lesson with Ms. Rosie. When she entered the practice room, he was already warming up. "I'd like to try a different approach to the Chopin piece," he said, Before she could speak, Ms. Rosie raised an eyebrow. "Oh? I've been trying to conquer the whole piece at once, but maybe I need to break it down and build it back up." A hint of a smile touched Ms. Rosie's lips. "Perhaps you are beginning to understand what it means to truly study music." For the next hour, they dissected the troublesome section measure by measure. By the end of the lesson, Marlon had made more progress than in the previous 2 weeks combined. "Something has changed in you," Ms. Rosie observed as Marlon prepared to leave. Marlon thought about his conversation with Jordan, about his father, about the connections that ran deeper than notes on a page. "I remembered why I play," he said simply. Ms. Rosie nodded, understanding in her silence. As David drove Marlon home, a light rain began to fall, drumming gently on the car roof in perfect rhythm with the Chopin piece now playing in Marlon's mind. The following weeks saw a transformation in Marlon's playing. He approached each piece with a new mindset, breaking difficult passages into manageable sections and building them back up. His fingers grew stronger, more precise, and the music began to flow from them like water. "Much better," Ms. Rosie commented during one session, which from her was high praise indeed. Marlon beamed. "I've been practicing differently." "I can tell," she replied. "Your technical execution has improved, but more importantly, your emotional connection to the music has deepened." "What changed?" Marlon thought about his conversation with Jordan. "I started playing for my dad again," he said quietly. "Not just to make him proud, but to honor his memory." Ms. Rosie made a sound of approval. "Music without emotion is just noise. You've rediscovered your purpose." One Tuesday afternoon, Marlon tackled the Chopin piece that had nearly broken his spirit. He'd been practicing it section by section for weeks. Today, he decided to attempt it in its entirety. He took a deep breath, positioned his hands over the keys, and began to play. The opening came easily now, his fingers dancing across the keys with newfound confidence. As he approached the difficult middle section, Marlon pushed away his doubts and focused on the memory of his father. The notes flowed from his fingertips, as if they'd always been there, waiting to be released. The complex rhythms between his left and right hands synchronized perfectly. Marlon lost himself in the music, forgetting technique, forgetting the practice room, forgetting everything except the pure joy of expression. When the final notes faded, he sat still, almost in shock at what had just happened. Slow clapping broke the silence. Marlon jumped, not having heard anyone enter. "That was beautiful," Jordan's deep voice said from the doorway. "You've found your voice." "Mike, I didn't know you were coming today," Marlon said, grinning. "I had a meeting nearby and thought I'd stop in." Jordan's footsteps approached, and Marlon felt him sit on the bench beside him. "Ms. Rosie told me you've been making incredible progress." "She did?" Marlon couldn't hide his surprise. Ms. Rosie rarely offered praise to anyone. "She says you've developed a maturity in your playing that usually takes years to achieve." Jordan's voice held genuine pride. "Something clicked for you, didn't it?" Marlon nodded. "What you said about playing for my dad. It changed everything. The music means something different now." Ms. Rosie entered the room, her light footsteps instantly recognizable. "That was exceptional, Marlon," she said. "You've broken through an important barrier." "I agree," Jordan added. "I think he's ready for the next step." "Next step?" Marlon asked. "A recital," Ms. Rosie replied. "Small, intimate, for friends and family. Every musician needs an audience to truly grow." Marlon felt a flutter of anxiety. "I don't know if I'm ready." "You are," Jordan and Ms. Rosie said, almost simultaneously. Later that day, Jordan walked with Marlon through the academy's hallways. "I'll help arrange everything," he promised. "Nothing too big, just a chance for you to share your gift with others." "What if I mess up?" Marlon asked, voicing his deepest fear. "Then you'll keep playing," Jordan replied simply. That's what professionals do. They don't let mistakes stop them. Over the next 2 weeks, preparations for the recital moved quickly. Jordan booked a small community center not far from Marlon's apartment and arranged for a proper grand piano to be delivered. Ms. Rosie helped. Marlon selected 5 pieces that showcased his range and technical abilities. The guest list was small. Marlon's mother, some teachers from his school, a few musicians from the academy, and several of Jordan's trusted friends who appreciated classical music. "No press," Jordan insisted. "This isn't about publicity, it's about music." 3 days before the recital, Marlon practiced late into the evening at the academy. When David arrived to drive him home, Marlon asked, "Do you think people will like my playing?" "I'm not a music expert," David replied honestly, "but even I can tell that what you do is special. You make people feel something." That night, as Marlon lay in bed, doubts crept in. The pieces were technically perfect now, but would they move people? Would his father be proud? He finally drifted off to sleep and had the most vivid dream. In it, he was playing at a grand concert hall. As his fingers moved across the keys, he could sense his father sitting in the front row, smiling proudly. The dream was so real that Marlon could almost feel his father's presence, hear his encouraging voice. When he woke the next morning, a strange calm had settled over him. The anxiety was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. "You seem different today," his mother observed, as she set breakfast before him. "I'm ready," Marlon said simply. The night before the recital, Jordan visited Marlon at home. "Nervous?" he asked. "Not anymore," Marlon replied with surprising confidence. "I had a dream about my dad last night. It felt like he was telling me it would be okay." Jordan was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes the people we lose stay with us in ways we don't fully understand," he said softly. "My father visits my dreams too, especially before big games." "Really? Really?" Jordan placed a small box in Marlon's hands. "I brought you something." Inside was a pair of cufflinks. "They're shaped like piano keys," Jordan explained, "for good luck tomorrow." "Thank you," Marlon whispered, deeply touched by the gesture. As Jordan prepared to leave, he placed a hand on Marlon's shoulder. "Remember something important tomorrow. When you play from your heart, it's impossible to fail. The notes might not always be perfect, but the feeling will be real." That night, Marlon slept peacefully, the cufflinks on his nightstand and his father's memory in his heart. Tomorrow would be his first real step toward the dream that once seemed impossible, playing for an audience that came specifically to hear him. And somehow, he knew it was just the beginning. The morning of the recital arrived with golden sunshine streaming through Marlon's bedroom window. He could feel the warmth on his face as he carefully dressed in the new suit his mother had bought. For the occasion, their first major purchase since Jordan had begun paying Elena a stipend for Marlon's music development. "You look so handsome," Elena said, her voice catching as she helped him with the cufflinks Jordan had given him. "Just like your father." Marlon swallowed the lump in his throat. "Will you tell me what he looked like again? On his performance days?" Elena's fingers gently straightened his collar. "He was tall and slim, with the most expressive hands, just like yours. When he dressed for performances, he stood straighter, as if the music lifted him from inside." She paused. But his eyes were what everyone noticed. Even after he lost his sight, they remained so alive, so full of feeling. The community center was only a short drive away. When they arrived, David was waiting to escort them inside. "Mr. Jordan is already here," he whispered to Marlon, along with about 30 guests. 30 guests. Marlon had expected maybe 10 or 15 people. His hands began to tremble slightly. The green room was small but comfortable. Ms. Rosie was waiting, ready to make last-minute adjustments to Marlon's program. "Remember your breathing," she instructed. "Start with your shoulders relaxed. Let the music flow through you, not from you." A gentle knock at the door announced Jordan's arrival. "Mind if I have a moment with our pianist?" he asked Ms. Rosie. When they were alone, Jordan sat beside Marlon. "How are you feeling, piano man?" "Like I might throw up," Marlon admitted honestly. Jordan laughed. "That's normal. I still get butterflies before big games, even after 6 championships." "You do?" "Every time. It means you care about doing well." Jordan's voice softened. "But here's what I learned. Those butterflies can either paralyze you or propel you. The choice is yours." Marlon nodded, taking a deep breath. "I want them to propel me." "That's my boy," Jordan said, gently squeezing his shoulder. "I'll be right in the front row." Shortly after Jordan left, David returned to guide Marlon to the stage. The wood floor creaked slightly under his feet as he approached the piano. The audience fell silent as he took his seat, adjusting the bench carefully just as Ms. Rosie had taught him. Marlon placed his hands on the keys, suddenly aware of every breath, every heartbeat. His fingers trembled as he began the first piece, Bach's Prelude in C major. The opening notes came out shaky, slightly off-tempo. Panic rose in his chest. He missed a note, then another. His mind raced. Everyone was watching, judging. He was failing. Then, clearly as if whispered directly into his ear, he heard Jordan's voice. "Don't think about the mistakes. Just keep moving forward." Marlon took a deep breath, steadied his hands, and started again from the beginning of the phrase. This time, his fingers found their confidence. The simple, flowing arpeggios of the Bach Prelude washed over the room like gentle waves. As he played, the nervousness melted away, replaced by a serene focus. From the Bach, he transitioned smoothly into Debussy's Clair de Lune, letting the impressionistic piece shimmer through his fingertips. He could feel the audience leaning forward, drawn into the moonlit landscape he was creating with sound. For his third piece, Marlon played a jazz standard his father had loved, Round Midnight by Thelonious Monk. Here, he added subtle improvisations, making the piece his own. Someone in the audience murmured appreciatively at a particularly creative passage. Next came Chopin's Revolutionary Etude, the piece that had once seemed impossible. Marlon attacked it with confident passion, his fingers flying across the keys with precision and fire. When the final chords resonated through the room, he heard several gasps of appreciation. For his finale, Marlon played the Fantaisie Impromptu that had nearly broken his spirit months earlier. Now, it flowed from him naturally, telling a story of struggle, perseverance, and triumph. He poured everything into it. His gratitude to Jordan, his love for his mother, his connection to his father's memory. As the final notes faded, the room remained silent for one breathless moment. Then, the applause erupted, enthusiastic, genuine, and surprisingly loud for such a small gathering. Marlon stood, bowing as Ms. Rosie had taught him, a smile spreading across his face. The reception afterward buzzed with conversation. Many people approached to congratulate him, their handshakes and kind words blurring together in a happy haze. Marlon's cheeks hurt from smiling so much. "Marlon," Jordan's voice cut through the chatter. "There's someone here who'd like to meet you." A firm handshake greeted Marlon. "I'm Professor Wilson from the Chicago Symphony Orchestra," a deep, measured voice said. "Mr. Jordan invited me to hear you play." Marlon's heart skipped a beat. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra? His dream? "Your technique is impressive for someone with so little formal training," Professor Wilson continued. "But what struck me was your musicality, your natural sense of phrasing and emotion." "Thank you, sir," Marlon managed to reply. "You have something special," Professor Wilson said, his tone serious. "With more work, you might be ready for our Young Musicians program." "The YMP?" Marlon whispered, hardly believing his ears. The program was legendary, a stepping stone that had launched numerous professional careers. "It's highly competitive," Professor Wilson cautioned. "But based on what I heard today, you should consider auditioning in the spring." After Professor Wilson moved on, Marlon stood frozen, processing what had just happened. Was that real?" he asked when he felt Jordan's familiar presence beside him. "Very real," Jordan confirmed, a smile in his voice. "You impressed him, Marlon. That doesn't happen often." Later, as the crowd thinned, Marlon's mother approached, pulling him into a tight hug. "Your father would have been so proud," she whispered, her voice breaking. What Marlon didn't know was that Jordan had watched his entire performance from the back of the room, not the front, as he'd promised. Jordan had wanted to observe the audience's genuine reactions without his celebrity presence, influencing them. What he'd seen had confirmed what he'd suspected from the beginning. Marlon Thompson had a rare gift that deserved to be shared with the world. As Marlon and his mother prepared to leave, David pulled Jordan aside with an urgent message. Jordan listened, his expression growing serious. He glanced at Marlon, who was happily accepting final congratulations from guests, completely unaware that a challenge was about to test everything he'd worked for. Marlon threw himself into preparation for the Young Musicians program audition with renewed dedication. Each morning, he woke early to practice before school, and each evening, he worked with Ms. Rosie until his fingers ached. The chance Professor Wilson had offered felt like the next step toward his impossible dream. "Your octave work is improving," Ms. Rosie noted during one particularly grueling session. "But you must be careful not to strain your hands. Technique without proper form leads to injury." But Marlon was too excited to heed her warnings. When she limited his practice time to 3 hours daily, he secretly added another hour at home, pushing himself to master the challenging audition pieces. 3 weeks before the audition date, Marlon noticed a strange tingling in his right hand. By the following day, a dull ache had settled into his wrist. Still, he pushed through his practice session, ignoring the increasing discomfort. During his lesson with Ms. Rosie, she stopped him mid-piece. "Your right hand is favoring the fourth finger." "Why?" "It's nothing," Marlon insisted. "Just a little sore." Ms. Rosie gently took his hand, her fingers probing his wrist and palm. When she touched a specific spot, Marlon winced. "How long has it been hurting?" she asked, her voice unusually gentle. "A few days," Marlon admitted. "But it's just from practicing hard." Ms. Rosie sighed. "We're done for today. You need to see a doctor." The diagnosis came the following afternoon: tendinitis in his right wrist and hand. The doctor's words fell like stones in Marlon's stomach. "Complete rest for at least 3 weeks," the doctor instructed. "No piano, not even light practice." 3 weeks? Marlon's voice cracked. "But my audition." "I'm sorry," the doctor said kindly. "If you play now, you risk permanent damage. As a musician, that's not a chance you can take." The ride home was silent. Elena tried to comfort her son. But Marlon turned his face toward the window, hiding the tears that threatened to spill over. "It's just a setback," she said softly. "There will be other auditions." "You don't understand," Marlon whispered. "This was my chance. Professor Wilson won't offer again." That evening, Marlon shut himself in his room, refusing dinner. When he heard the familiar sound of Jordan's car pulling up outside their apartment building, he buried his face in his pillow. He couldn't face his mentor, couldn't admit that he'd ruined everything through his own stubbornness. Elena let Jordan in, explaining the situation in hushed tones. Marlon heard their voices but couldn't make out the words. Then, Jordan's heavy footsteps approached his door. "Marlon, can I come in?" When Marlon didn't answer, Jordan spoke through the door. "You know," he said conversationally, "I once played in an NBA Finals game with the flu, had a 103-degree fever, could barely stand." "So?" Marlon mumbled, despite himself. "So sometimes our bodies fail us. But our spirit doesn't have to." Marlon remained silent. "I'm coming in," Jordan announced, opening the door. The bed shifted as Jordan sat down. "Talk to me, piano man." "I messed up," Marlon admitted, his voice small. "I practiced too much, didn't listen to Ms. Rosie, and now I've ruined everything." "Have you?" Jordan asked calmly. "Or have you just hit another wall?" "The audition is in 3 weeks. The doctor says no piano for at least that long. And you believe that means it's over?" Marlon sat up, frustration breaking through his despair. "Of course it's over. I can't audition if I can't play." Jordan mused. "You know what I think? I think you need to call Professor Wilson and tell him the truth." "And say what?" "Sorry, I was stupid and hurt myself." "How about, I've developed tendinitis from overtraining because I care so deeply about this opportunity?" Marlon considered. This. He'll just say to try again next year. Maybe. Or maybe not. But either way, you'll have been honest. That matters. The next morning, with Jordan by his side for moral support, Marlon called Professor Wilson. His hands trembled as he explained the situation, voice cracking occasionally with emotion. To his astonishment, Professor Wilson's response was understanding. "Injuries happen to the best musicians, Marlon," he said. "It shows your dedication, if not your wisdom." There was a smile in his voice. "I can arrange a special audition 2 months from now, after you've fully recovered. The committee owes me a favor." After hanging up, Marlon sat in stunned silence. "See?" Jordan said, squeezing his shoulder. "Honesty and perseverance. That's how you win in life." The following weeks taught Marlon patience he never knew he possessed. Forbidden from playing, he found new ways to study music. Jordan introduced him to visualization techniques used by professional athletes. "When I couldn't practice on court," Jordan explained, "I'd run through plays in my mind. Every dribble, every pass, every shot. Your brain can't always tell the difference between vivid imagination and reality." Marlon began practicing mentally, hearing the music in his head, feeling phantom keys beneath his still fingers. Ms. Rosie taught him to strengthen his left hand while his right recovered, and to study music theory more deeply. "Many great pianists have overcome physical limitations," she told him. "Schumann damaged his hand with a mechanical device meant to strengthen his fingers. He still composed masterpieces." One evening, as Marlon sat with his bandaged hand resting on a pillow, Jordan brought over a recording of a basketball game. "Listen," Jordan instructed. "Don't just hear the announcer. Listen to the rhythm of the game, the squeak of sneakers, the bounce of the ball, the crowd's ebb and flow. It's music, too." Marlon listened, beginning to understand what Jordan meant. There was rhythm and flow in everything, patterns and variations, like a complex musical piece. When I was at the height of my career, Jordan said quietly, I broke my foot. Everyone said I was finished, that I'd never play the same way again. What did you do? Marlon asked. I reinvented my game. Couldn't rely on the same moves, so I developed new ones. When I returned, I was different, but better. As weeks passed, Marlon's hand slowly healed. The doctor cleared him for gentle exercises, then limited practice. Through it all, Marlon maintained the mental discipline he'd developed during his recovery. The night before his rescheduled audition, Jordan visited. They sat at the Kit Rossi table, drinking hot chocolate just like when they'd first met. Nervous? Jordan asked. Marlon considered the question. Not like before. I feel ready. You know why? Marlon shook his head. Because you've faced something worse than failure, the fear of never getting to try. That changes a person. Jordan reached across the table, gently tapping Marlon's now healed hand. This setback made you stronger, more patient. You learned to hear music differently, to feel it beyond your fingers. Do you think I can still do it, even with the lost practice time? Jordan smiled. Marlon could hear it in his voice. I think you're going to surprise yourself tomorrow. Sometimes our greatest growth happens when we're forced to step back. As Jordan prepared to leave, he paused at the door. One more thing, Piano Man. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm proud of how you handled this challenge. That says more about your character than any performance could. That night, Marlon slept soundly, his healing hands relaxed on top of his blanket. In his dreams, he played with a newfound confidence, not just with his fingers, but with his entire being. Somehow, he knew that tomorrow would be different than he'd imagined, but no less important in his journey. The morning of Marlon's rescheduled audition dawned clear and crisp. As he dressed carefully in his best clothes, he felt surprisingly calm. The weeks of forced rest had changed something fundamental in how he approached music, and perhaps life itself. Ready? Elena asked, helping him adjust his tie. As I'll ever be, Marlon replied with a small smile. David arrived promptly at 9 to drive them to the Symphony Hall. During the ride, Marlon mentally rehearsed his pieces, his fingers moving slightly against his legs. Mr. Jordan asked me to give you this, David said, passing back a small box. Inside, Marlon found a smooth stone. A note in Braille was attached. Carried this in my pocket during Game 6. 1998, now it's yours. Feel the weight. Remember the work. MJ Marlon closed his fingers around the stone, drawing strength from its solid presence. Game 6, Jordan's final championship-winning shot. The connection wasn't lost on him. At the Symphony Hall, Ms. Rosie was waiting. How are the hands? She asked immediately. Good, Marlon replied. Strong but relaxed. Excellent. We have 30 minutes to warm up. In the practice room, Marlon gradually reacquainted himself with the piano, starting with simple scales before moving to sections of his audition pieces. To his surprise, the music flowed easily, as if the mental practice had somehow translated to his fingers. Your technique has matured, Ms. Rosie observed with rare approval. The forced rest may have been a blessing in disguise. Soon, it was time. As Marlon waited outside the audition room, he felt Jordan's presence before he heard him. Thought I'd wish you luck in person, Jordan said quietly. Thank you, Marlon replied. For everything. Just do what you know how to do, Jordan advised. The rest will take care of itself. As Jordan turned to leave, Marlon asked, "Will you stay? To listen?" "Wouldn't miss it," Jordan promised. The audition room was larger than Marlon had expected, with high ceilings that made even whispers echo. He could sense several people seated at a table, their papers rustling as he entered. "Marlon Thompson," a woman's voice called. "Yes, ma'am. Whenever you're ready." Marlon took his seat at the grand piano, adjusting the bench precisely. He placed his hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first piece, Bach's Italian Concerto, came naturally, his fingers finding the complex counterpoint with ease. For his second piece, he chose Liszt's Un Sospiro, demonstrating the cross-hand technique he'd perfected during his recovery. The challenging runs that once seemed impossible now flowed like water. Finally, he played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece that connected him most deeply to his father's memory. As the final notes faded, Marlon felt a profound sense of peace. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," Professor Wilson said. "That was remarkable. We'll be in touch soon." Afterward, Jordan found Marlon in the hallway. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Good," Marlon said, surprised to find it was true regardless of the outcome, like I played my best. "That's all anyone can ask for," Jordan replied. "How about we celebrate with lunch? I know a quiet place nearby." The restaurant was small and cozy, tucked away from the busy downtown streets. After they ordered, Jordan seemed unusually reflective. "There's something I've been meaning to share with you," he said. "Something about why music has always been special to me." "I thought basketball was your thing," Marlon said with a smile. "It is. But there was a time when music helped me through some dark days." Jordan's voice grew softer. "Early in my career with the Bulls, the pressure was intense. Everyone expected perfection. One night, after a particularly brutal loss, I couldn't face going home. I just drove around the city." Marlon listened intently, sensing something important in Jordan's story. "I ended up at this tiny jazz club on the South Side. Barely a dozen people inside. There was a blind pianist playing. Man, he was incredible. Not famous, just authentic. I sat in the back, anonymous, and just listened for hours." Jordan paused, taking a sip of water. The pianist played with such freedom, such joy, despite his challenges. It reminded me why I loved basketball before the fame, before the expectations. That night changed something for me. "Do you remember the musician's name?" Marlon asked, suddenly curious. Jordan was quiet for a moment. "Raymond, I think. Ray Thompson." Marlon froze. Thompson was my dad's last name. The silence between them stretched as realization dawned. "What was the club called?" Marlon asked, his heart racing. "The Blue Note," Jordan replied softly. "On 43rd Street. My dad played there every Thursday," Marlon whispered. "For years. Until when? Until the accident. When I was 6. Marlon's hands trembled slightly. "You heard my father play?" Jordan reached across the table, placing his hand over Marlon's. "I did more than hear him play. After the set, I talked with him, told him how his music had touched me, helped me remember why I played basketball." "What did he say?" Marlon asked, hungry for this unexpected connection to his father. "He said something I never forgot. When you play for the love of it, you never truly fail." Then he mentioned having a young son, who was also blind, but showing musical talent. Marlon couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotion. "Maybe that's why I felt drawn to help you," Jordan said quietly. "Life has a funny way of coming full circle." As their food arrived, Marlon struggled to process this revelation. His father, his hero, had influenced Michael Jordan, had shared wisdom that helped shape one of the greatest athletic careers in history? "Did you know?" Marlon finally asked. "When you first heard me in the park, did you know I was Ray's son?" "No," Jordan admitted. "Not at first. There was something familiar about your style, but I couldn't place it. It wasn't until you mentioned your father's name weeks later that it clicked." They ate in contemplative silence for a while, both processing the significance of their connection. "Your father gave me something when I needed it most," Jordan eventually said. "Perspective, purpose. Now, maybe I can help his son find the same." On the drive back to Marlon's apartment, they shared memories, Jordan recalling specifics about Ray's playing style that brought tears to Marlon's eyes, and Marlon sharing childhood stories that made Jordan laugh. What Marlon couldn't know was that Jordan was still keeping one part of the story to himself, a promise he'd made to Ray Thompson that night years ago, a promise he intended to fulfill through Marlon. As they pulled up to the apartment building, Jordan's phone buzzed with a message. Reading it, he smiled. "Professor Wilson," he explained. "He wants to meet with us tomorrow morning." "Is that good or bad?" Marlon asked nervously. "With Wilson." "Could go either way," Jordan replied honestly. "But whatever happens, we now have something that transcends auditions and programs." "What's that?" Marlon asked. "A connection that was meant to be," Jordan said simply. "Your father made sure of that." Sleep eluded Marlon that night. He lay, awake, mind racing with the revelation about his father and Jordan. The coincidence seemed too perfect, too meaningful to be random chance. His fingers absently tapped piano keys on his blanket, playing his father's favorite tunes from memory. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through his blinds. Marlon dressed carefully in the suit he'd worn for his recital, his movements deliberate and focused. The stone Jordan had given him rested in his pocket, a tangible reminder of perseverance. "You seem calm," Elena observed as she helped straighten his collar. "I am," Marlon replied, surprised to find it true. "Whatever Professor Wilson says, I know I played my best yesterday." David arrived promptly at 9. "Mr. Jordan is already at Symphony Hall," he informed them. "He asked me to bring you directly there." The drive passed in contemplative silence. Marlon ran his fingers over Jordan's stone, drawing strength from its smooth surface. Regardless of today's outcome, he now carried a piece of living history, a connection between his father, Jordan, and himself that transcended his musical aspirations. Symphony Hall's marble floors echoed beneath their footsteps as David led them through the grand lobby. The building smelled of polish and history, of countless performances and artistic triumphs. "This way," David directed, guiding them down a hallway to Professor Wilson's office. Jordan was waiting outside, his cologne familiar and reassuring. "Ready?" he asked, squeezing Marlon's shoulder. "Ready," Marlon confirmed. Professor Wilson's office was warm and lived in, smelling of old books and coffee. Marlon could hear the professor shuffling papers as they entered. "Ah, Marlon, Mr. Jordan, please, have a seat," Wilson greeted them. The leather chair creaked as Marlon sat, his hands folded in his lap. "I want to discuss your audition," Wilson began. Frankly, it was unexpected. Marlon's heart sank. Had he misread his own performance? "Most young pianists your age focus entirely on technical precision," Wilson continued. "You certainly demonstrated that skill, but there was something more, a maturity of interpretation I rarely encounter in students twice your age." Marlon exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. "The committee was quite impressed," Wilson added, "particularly with your Chopin." There's a story behind your connection to that piece, isn't there? Yes, sir, Marlon replied. It was my father's favorite. He was a jazz pianist who loved classical music, too. Wilson made a thoughtful sound. That explains it. You played as if the music were part of you, not merely notes to be performed. Thank you, sir. Now, regarding the Young Musicians program, Wilson continued, his tone shifting to business. The formal audition period has ended, and selections have technically been finalized. Marlon felt his hopes beginning to crumble. However, Wilson added, the committee has decided to make an exception in your case. An exception? Marlon asked, hardly daring to believe. We would like to offer you conditional acceptance to the program, beginning next month. Marlon couldn't speak, emotion closing his throat. The condition being, Wilson continued, that you work with our staff physiotherapist to develop proper techniques that will prevent future injuries. We invest considerably in our young musicians. We need to ensure your longevity. I thank you, Marlon managed finally. I'll work with anyone, do whatever it takes. Excellent. Papers rustled as Wilson gathered documents. There's one more thing. Each year, we select one student from the program to perform a solo piece at our Young Artists Showcase. It's quite prestigious, attended by donors, critics, and industry professionals. That sounds amazing, Marlon said. It's also months away, Wilson added, but I'd like you to begin preparing. I believe your Chopin would be perfect, with some refinement, of course. After reviewing the program details, Wilson shook Marlon's hand firmly. Welcome to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's Young Musicians Program, Mr. Thompson. I believe we'll accomplish great things together. Outside Wilson's office, Marlon finally allowed the reality to sink in. I made it, he whispered, his voice trembling. I actually made it. You earned it, Jordan corrected gently. Every step of the way. Elena embraced her son, tears flowing freely. Your father would be so proud, she whispered. Jordan suggested celebrating with a tour of Symphony Hall. As David led Elena to arrange transportation, Jordan guided Marlon through the historic building's corridors. This is really happening, Marlon said, still processing his acceptance. Believe it, Jordan replied. Though this is just the beginning. They paused at the entrance to the main concert hall. Jordan described the towering ceiling, the rows of plush seats, the magnificent stage where the world's greatest musicians had performed. One day, you'll play here, Jordan said with certainty. Not just in the student showcase, but as a featured soloist. How can you be so sure? Marlon asked. Jordan was quiet for a moment. Because I recognize the same fire in you that I had. Different arena, same spirit. As they walked slowly through the empty concert hall, their footsteps echoing in the vast space, Jordan seemed contemplative. There's something I haven't told you, he finally said. About that night at the Blue Note, when I met your father. Marlon stopped walking, sensing the importance of what was coming. After we talked about music and basketball, your father mentioned his concerns about your future. He worried that his blindness and yours would limit your opportunities. Marlon nodded, having heard his mother express similar worries over the years. I was nobody special back then, Jordan continued. Just a promising rookie with potential. But something about your father's story moved me. I gave him my contact information and told him that if he ever needed anything for your music education, he should call me. Did he? Marlon asked. No, Jordan said softly. The accident happened just weeks later. I read about it in the paper. A blind jazz pianist killed, his young son injured. I tried to find your family, but without your mother's name or your exact location, I couldn't connect. Jordan placed a hand on Marlon's shoulder. When I heard you playing in the park that day, something resonated with me. I couldn't place it immediately, but your style, your emotion, it reminded me of him. It wasn't until you mentioned your father that everything fell into place. So, helping me? It was about fulfilling a promise to my dad? Marlon asked, trying to understand. At first, perhaps, Jordan admitted. But, Marlon, you earned every opportunity through your own talent and dedication. I may have opened a door, but you walked through it on your own merit. They continued walking, their footsteps synchronized on the polished floor. Your father once told me that music was his way of seeing beyond his limitations, Jordan said. He believed you had the same gift, maybe even stronger. Marlon felt a profound connection to his father in that moment, a continuation of a conversation begun years ago between two men from different worlds, united by respect and understanding. As they reached the magnificent stage, Jordan described its curvature, its perfect acoustics. "Stand here," he instructed, guiding Marlon to center stage. "Feel it." Marlon stood still, absorbing the energy of the space, imagining the hundreds of seats filled with people, the anticipation before a performance. Even empty, the hall seemed to vibrate with possibility. "This is where you belong," Jordan said, simply. Your father knew it. Now you know it too. Later, as they prepared to leave Symphony Hall, Professor Wilson approached with forms for Elena to sign. While they discussed logistics, Jordan led Marlon to a quiet alcove. "I have something for you," Jordan said. "I've been waiting for the right moment." He pressed a small object into Marlon's hand, a cassette tape. "What's this?" Marlon asked, running his fingers over the plastic case. "The Blue Note recorded your father's performances occasionally," Jordan explained. "I tracked this down years ago after reading about his accident. I've kept it all this time, not knowing if I'd ever find his family." Marlon clutched the tape tightly, overwhelmed by the gift. His father's music, preserved by the man who now guided his own musical journey. "Thank you," he whispered, unable to express the depth of his gratitude. "Your journey is just beginning," Jordan said softly. "But now, you carry your past and your future together." 6 months passed in a whirlwind of learning and growth. The Young Musicians program transformed Marlon's playing and expanded his world in ways he'd never imagined. 3 times weekly, he worked with instructors who challenged and refined his skills. For the first time, he found himself surrounded by other talented young musicians who shared his passion. "Your octave technique has improved dramatically," Ms. Rosie observed during one of their sessions, which she continued alongside his YMP training. "And your interpretation of the Romantic composers shows real maturity." Marlon beamed at the rare praise. "The program has been amazing. I'm learning so much from everyone." Through Jordan's assistance, Elena had found a better job as an administrative assistant at a music publishing company, allowing them to move to a larger apartment closer to Symphony Hall. The new place had enough room for the baby grand piano. Jordan had insisted on providing on permanent loan. "It belonged to a friend who doesn't play anymore," Jordan had explained, though Marlon suspected it was purchased specifically for him. One Sunday afternoon, Marlon performed with the youth orchestra at Symphony Hall. The program featured young soloists, with Marlon playing Liszt's Liebestraum. Though not the main concert hall, the recital space still held over 300 people, the largest audience Marlon had ever played for. Backstage after the performance, Marlon chatted excitedly with his new friends, Sophia, a violinist, with perfect pitch, Jamal, a cellist who practiced even more obsessively than Marlon, and Lynn, a clarinet player whose technical precision was matched only by her expressiveness. "Marlon," David's familiar voice called. "Someone's here to see you." "Mike?" Marlon asked, recognizing the distinctive footsteps approaching. "Great performance, Piano Man," Jordan said warmly. "You owned that stage." Marlon introduced Jordan to his friends, who tried unsuccessfully to hide their awe at meeting the basketball legend. "Mr. Jordan has been my mentor," Marlon explained simply. After his friends departed, Jordan guided Marlon to a quiet corner, backstage. "I'm proud of you," Jordan said. "You've come so far." "I couldn't have done it without you," Marlon replied earnestly. "No," Jordan corrected him gently. "You had the talent and the heart. I just opened a door. You walked through it on your own." They talked about Marlon's progress, how he'd found his place among the other young musicians, how his confidence had grown both at the piano and away from it. "Professor Wilson caught me after the performance," Marlon said. "He mentioned something. Exciting." "Oh?" Jordan prompted. "Juilliard is sending representatives next month to scout for their summer program. He's recommending me for an audition." "Marlon, that's incredible. If I get accepted, it would mean spending 6 weeks in New York," Marlon continued. "They provide housing, instruction from Juilliard faculty, and performances at Lincoln Center. And if that goes well..." Jordan let the implication hang in the air. "It could potentially lead to a full scholarship after high school," Marlon finished, the possibility both thrilling and terrifying. "New York," Jordan mused. "That's a big step." "I'm nervous," Marlon admitted. "New York is so far from home." "Growth happens outside our comfort zones," Jordan said. "Trust me on that." As they walked toward the exit, Marlon sensed something different in Jordan's demeanor, a slight hesitation in his usually confident stride, a tension in his voice. "Is everything okay, Mike?" Marlon asked. "Just some family matters," Jordan replied after a brief pause. "Nothing for you to worry about." Marlon nodded, respecting Jordan's privacy, though he sensed there was more to the story. In the following weeks, Marlon divided his time between his YMP responsibilities and preparing for the Juilliard audition. He worked tirelessly on his repertoire, choosing pieces that showcased both technical brilliance and emotional depth. Jordan's visits became less frequent, though he called regularly to check on Marlon's progress. During one call, Marlon detected something strained in Jordan's voice. "Are you sure everything's okay?" Marlon pressed. "You sound different." "Just busy," Jordan assured him. "My mother hasn't been feeling well lately, so I've been spending more time with my family." "I'm sorry to hear that," Marlon said. "Is there anything I can do?" "Just keep working hard," Jordan replied. "Your success brings joy to more people than you realize." The day of the Juilliard audition arrived with perfect spring weather. Marlon felt prepared and surprisingly calm as he walked into the designated recital hall at the Chicago Symphony Center. The Juilliard representatives, 2 distinguished faculty members, greeted him warmly. "We've heard wonderful things about you from Professor Wilson," one of them said. "We're looking forward to your performance." Marlon played with confidence and emotional depth, pouring everything he'd learned over the past months into his audition. When he finished, the quiet appreciation from the representatives told him everything he needed to know. "Very impressive, Mr. Thompson," the senior representative said. "We'll be in touch within the week, but I think it's safe to say you should keep your summer calendar open." Outside, Elena waited anxiously. "How did it go?" "Really well," Marlon said, grinning. "They as much as told me I'm in." That evening, they celebrated with a special dinner at home. Marlon had just finished describing the audition in detail when the phone rang. "It's Mr. Jordan," Elena said, handing him the receiver. "Mike! I think I got into Juilliard's summer program," Marlon exclaimed. "That's fantastic news," Jordan replied, genuine pleasure in his voice. "I never doubted you for a second." After congratulating him, Jordan's tone grew more serious. "Listen, Marlon, I need to see you. There's something important I'd like to discuss. Would you be available to visit my home this weekend?" "Your home?" Marlon asked, surprised. In all their time together, Jordan had never invited him to his house. "Yes, it's a private matter." "Of course," Marlon agreed, curiosity mingling with concern. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Jordan assured him. "I just need your help with something special." After hanging up, Marlon sat thoughtfully. At the piano, his fingers absently playing a quiet melody. Jordan had given him so much, had transformed his life in ways Marlon could never have imagined. Whatever Jordan needed, Marlon was determined to repay even a fraction of that generosity. What Marlon couldn't know was that Jordan was facing a deeply personal challenge, one that would soon bring their musical journey full circle in an unexpected way. As Marlon practiced into the evening, Jordan sat in his study miles away, listening to Ray Thompson's old cassette recording, planning a special request that would test Marlon's heart as much as his talent. The drive to Jordan's home that Saturday morning left Marlon breathless with anticipation. David narrated the journey as they passed through increasingly exclusive neighborhoods, finally turning onto a private road. "We're approaching the gate now," David explained. "The property is about 3 acres, with beautiful landscaping and a basketball court in the back, of course." When the car finally stopped, Marlon felt a flutter of nervousness. This was Michael Jordan's private sanctuary, a place few people ever got to visit. "This way, Marlon," David said, helping him from the car. "There are 5 steps up to the front door." The massive door swung open before they reached it. "Welcome, Marlon," Jordan's familiar voice greeted him, warmer than usual. "Thank you for coming." Inside, the house smelled of wood polish and something pleasant Marlon couldn't quite identify, perhaps luxury itself. Jordan's footsteps echoed slightly on what Marlon guessed were marble floors. "Let me show you around a bit," Jordan offered, placing a guiding hand lightly on Marlon's shoulder. "The main floor has a great room, Kit Rosie, dining room, my office, and, what I think might interest you most, a music room." "You have a music room?" Marlon asked, surprised. "Installed it a few years ago, though I rarely use it," Jordan admitted. "This way." They walked through several rooms, Jordan describing the space as they went. Finally, they entered a room that felt different acoustically. Less echo, more warmth. "Here we are," Jordan said. "The piano is a Steinway Model D, concert grand, supposedly one of the best in the world, but I'll let you be the judge of that." Marlon extended his hands, feeling the smooth, polished wood of an enormous piano. His fingers trembled slightly as they found the keyboard cover. "May I?" he asked. "That's why we're here," Jordan replied. Marlon lifted the cover and pressed a few keys, immediately recognizing the rich, perfectly balanced tone of a world-class instrument. He played a brief scale, marveling at the piano's response. "It's magnificent," he whispered. "Perfect condition, too." "It should be," Jordan said with a chuckle. "It's barely been played. But that's about to change, I hope." They sat in comfortable leather chairs near the piano. Marlon sensed a shift in Jordan's demeanor, a slight tension, something unsaid. "So," Marlon ventured, "you mentioned needing my help with something?" Jordan was quiet for a moment. "I have a favor to ask," he finally said. "My mother's 80th birthday is coming up. She's been having health problems lately, and I want to make it special." I'm sorry to hear she's unwell, Marlon said sincerely. Thank you, Jordan replied. The doctors are concerned. It's her heart. Marlon nodded, understanding the gravity in Jordan's voice. Mom has always loved classical piano music, Jordan continued, especially Chopin. When I was growing up, she'd play recordings on Sunday afternoons while she prepared dinner. It's one of my strongest childhood memories. Her in the Kit Rossi, Chopin filling our home. Which pieces does she like best? Marlon asked. The nocturnes, especially the E-flat major, the same one that was your father's favorite. Marlon felt a strange tingle up his spine at the coincidence. Would you consider playing at her birthday celebration? Jordan asked, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. It's a private family event. No cameras, no press, just my mother, siblings, and a few close friends. Marlon sat speechless, processing the request. Michael Jordan, who had given him so much, who had transformed his life, was asking for this simple yet profound favor. You want me to play for your family? After everything you've done for me? Music has a way of healing, Jordan said quietly, and right now, my family could use some healing. Of course I'll play, Marlon said immediately. It would be an honor. Relief was evident in Jordan's voice. Thank you. It's in 3 weeks, at our lake house. I'll have David arrange everything. They spent the next hour discussing the program. Marlon would play the Chopin Nocturne, of course, but also several other pieces that Mrs. Jordan might enjoy. As they talked, Marlon could feel the weight this celebration carried for Jordan, the unspoken fear that it might be his mother's last birthday. There's something else, Marlon said, an idea forming. If you have recordings of the specific pieces your mother loves, I could study her favorite interpretations. And maybe I could compose something special just for her. You compose? Jordan asked, surprised. I've been working on it, Marlon admitted. Professor Wilson has been encouraging me to develop my own voice, not just interpret others. She would love that, Jordan said, genuine appreciation in his voice. Before leaving, Marlon played briefly on the Steinway, getting a feel for the magnificent instrument. As his fingers danced across the keys, he heard Jordan sigh contentedly. From across the room, "Your playing reminds me of your father's sometimes," Jordan observed. "Same soulfulness, but with your own distinct voice." On the drive home, Marlon's mind raced with ideas for Mrs. Jordan's birthday performance. This wasn't just a favor for his mentor. It was a chance to give back, to use his gift to bring joy to the woman who had raised the man who changed his life. That evening, Marlon called Professor Wilson to explain the situation. A private performance for the Jordan family. Wilson mused, "That's quite an honor." "I want it to be perfect," Marlon said, "especially the Chopin. It needs to be special." "The Chopin is already in excellent shape," Wilson assured him. "But if you'd like, we can dedicate your next few sessions to refining it further." Over the following weeks, Marlon divided his time between YMP rehearsals, Juilliard's summer program preparations, and crafting the perfect birthday performance. He worked diligently on a special composition, weaving together elements of classical structure with subtle jazz influences that hinted at his and his father's musical heritage. One afternoon, while Marlon practiced at home, Elena came into the room and listened quietly. "That's new," she observed when he finished. "Something you're writing?" "For Mrs. Jordan's birthday," Marlon explained. "I'm trying to capture something meaningful." Elena sat beside him on the piano bench. "Your father used to compose pieces for special occasions too," she said softly. "He wrote one for our wedding and another when you were born." "I didn't know that," Marlon said, surprised. The one he wrote for you was called Little Hands, Elena continued. He would play it when you were fussy as a baby. It always calmed you instantly. Do you remember how it went? Marlon asked eagerly. Elena hummed a simple, gentle melody. Marlon quickly found the notes on the piano, his fingers bringing his father's composition back to life. That's it, Elena whispered, her voice thick with emotion. In that moment, inspiration struck. Marlon began improvising around the melody, building a new composition that incorporated his father's theme within his own musical language. As he played, he felt a profound connection to his father, to Jordan, to the legacy of music that flowed through all their lives. The night before Mrs. Jordan's celebration, Marlon performed his completed piece for his mother. "It's beautiful," she said, wiping away tears. "It honors your father while being uniquely yours. Do you think Mrs. Jordan will like it?" Marlon asked anxiously. "She'll love it," Elena assured him, "because it comes from your heart." As Marlon packed his performance clothes that night, he felt a strange sense of destiny. What had begun as a chance encounter in a park had evolved into something profound, a musical journey connecting 3 generations through the universal language of music. Tomorrow, he would play not just for Mrs. Jordan's birthday, but for the remarkable circle of connection that had brought them all together. The morning of Dolores Jordan's birthday dawned clear and bright. Marlon woke early, his fingers already moving through passages of music in his mind. He dressed carefully in the new suit Jordan had sent, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, tailored perfectly to his measurements. "You look so handsome," Elena said, adjusting his tie. "Like a true concert pianist." "I'm nervous," Marlon admitted. "This feels bigger than the auditions somehow." "Because it's personal," Elena replied wisely. "Technical perfection matters less than the heart you put into it." David arrived promptly at 10 to drive them to the Jordan family lake house, about an hour outside Chicago. As they left the city behind, David described the passing scenery, rolling countryside giving way to forested areas, and finally, the sparkling expanse of the lake. "It's a beautiful property," David explained as they turned onto a private road. "Right on the water, very secluded. Mrs. Jordan loves to garden, so the grounds are spectacular." When they arrived, Marlon could smell flowers and freshly cut grass. Birds sang in nearby trees, and somewhere in the distance, water lapped gently against a shore. The sounds created a peaceful atmosphere that immediately calmed his nerves. Marlon, welcome." Jordan's voice approached from the direction of the house. "And Ms. Thompson, thank you both for coming." "Thank you for inviting us," Elena replied warmly. "Everything's set up on the back terrace," Jordan explained. "It overlooks the lake, Mom's favorite spot. The piano was delivered yesterday and tuned this morning." As they walked through the house, Marlon could hear quiet conversations and occasional laughter. The gathering of family preparing for a celebration. The air smelled of food being prepared and fresh flowers arranged in vases. "Most of the family is already here," Jordan said. "About 20 people total, my siblings and their families. A few of Mom's closest friends. Very intimate." They reached the terrace, and Marlon immediately noticed the different acoustic quality of the space, partly enclosed but open to the lakeside, creating a natural amphitheater effect. "The piano is here," Jordan guided Marlon's hand to a sleek, polished surface. "Another Steinway, smaller than mine but with a lovely tone. Perfect for this setting." Marlon ran his fingers lightly over the keys, getting a feel for the instrument. It responded beautifully to his touch, rich and resonant. "When would you like me to play?" Marlon asked. "After lunch," Jordan replied. "Around 2 o'clock. Feel free to warm up whenever you'd like." Everyone's excited to hear you, especially Mom. Shortly afterward, Jordan introduced Marlon and Elena to his mother. Marlon extended his hand, feeling a small, warm hand grasp his with surprising strength. "Michael tells me you play beautifully," Mrs. Jordan said, her voice gentle but clear. "I try my best, ma'am," Marlon replied respectfully. "Such a polite young man," Mrs. Jordan commented. "And talented too, from what my son tells me. Michael doesn't impress easily, you know." "Your son has changed my life, Mrs. Jordan," Marlon said sincerely. "I'm honored to play for you today." "Well, I look forward to hearing you," she replied. "Michael says you remind him of a musician he once heard years ago. Said it was one of the most moving performances he'd ever experienced." Marlon smiled, wondering if she knew the full story. Before he could respond, other family members approached to greet the birthday honoree, and Jordan guided Marlon and Elena to their seats for lunch. The meal was lively and warm, with easy conversation flowing around the table. Jordan's siblings welcomed Marlon and Elena graciously, treating them like old friends rather than outsiders. Marlon felt none of the intimidation he'd expected in the presence of such a famous family. After dessert was served, a beautiful cake that everyone described to Marlon in detail, Jordan clinked his glass gently. "As you all know, we're here to celebrate a remarkable woman," he began, his voice full of emotion. "Mom, you've been our foundation, our conscience, and our biggest supporter through everything. Today, I wanted to give you something special." Yai explained how he'd met Marlon, describing his talent and dedication without mentioning the connection to Ray Thompson. "Music has always been important to you, Mom, so today, Marlon will play some of your favorite pieces." Applause rippled through the gathering as Marlon made his way to the piano. He took a moment to center himself, feeling the gentle breeze from the lake, hearing the attentive silence of the audience. "Happy birthday, Mrs. Jordan," he said, turning toward where he knew she was seated. "I'll begin with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, which I understand is a favorite of yours." Marlon began to play, his fingers finding the familiar notes with confidence. The piece flowed naturally, its gentle melodies carrying across the terrace and over the water. As he played, he infused the well-known composition with subtle personal touches. Slight rubato here, a more pronounced dynamic contrast there, making it his own while honoring its classical beauty. From where he sat, he heard Mrs. Jordan sigh, contentedly. The sound encouraged him, and he leaned further into the emotional heart of the piece. When the nocturne concluded, warm applause followed. Marlon smiled and continued with two more classical selections that Jordan had mentioned his mother loved, a Bach prelude and Mozart's Rondo alla Turca, which he played with spirited precision. Then, without announcement, Marlon transitioned into his original composition. He had titled it Full Circle in his mind, though he hadn't shared the name with anyone. The piece began with a simple statement of his father's Little Hands melody, played softly and tenderly. Gradually, he built upon this foundation, weaving in elements of gospel harmonies, which Jordan had mentioned his mother loved from her church upbringing, classical motifs from the Chopin she treasured, and subtle jazz influences that connected to Marlon's own heritage. The composition moved through sections of reflection, joy, and gentle melancholy before building to an uplifting conclusion that returned to the original melody, now transformed through its journey. As the final notes faded over the lake, complete silence fell over the gathering. Then Marlon heard sniffling, not just from Mrs. Jordan, but from several people in the room, including, he suspected, Michael Jordan himself. After a moment, gentle applause began, growing stronger and warmer. Marlon stood and bowed, his heart full at the reception of his most personal work. He felt a presence approach and recognized Mrs. Jordan's light floral perfume. Her hands found his, warm and slightly trembling. "Young man," she said, voice thick, with emotion, "you've given me the most beautiful gift." "Thank you, Mrs. Jordan," Marlon replied sincerely. "It was an honor to compose something especially for you." "You composed that?" she asked, surprise evident in her voice. "Michael didn't tell me you were a composer as well." "It's a recent development," Marlon admitted. "The melody at the heart of it was actually written by my father for me when I was born. I wanted to share something that connected our families." Mrs. Jordan squeezed his hands. "Well, it touched my heart deeply. Thank you." As the gathering dispersed into smaller groups enjoying the afternoon, Jordan suggested Marlon might enjoy walking near the lake. They strolled together down a gentle path, the sounds of water and birdsong creating a peaceful backdrop. "Thank you," Jordan said, his voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. "My mother was diagnosed with heart problems last month. The doctors aren't sure how much time she has left." Marlon understood suddenly why this performance had meant so much. "I'm so sorry, Mike." "Today meant everything to her," Jordan continued. "Especially your composition. I've never seen her so moved." "Music helps us say the things we can't find words for," Marlon said quietly. Jordan nodded. "Exactly." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the water lapping against the shore. "Your playing reminded me of your father's," Jordan finally said. "Same soulfulness, but with your own voice. He would be incredibly proud of the musician you've become." As they walked back toward the house, Marlon realized how dramatically his life had changed since that rainy day in the park, when a stranger had sat beside him on the piano bench. What had begun as a chance encounter had blossomed into a profound connection between families, between generations, between musical traditions. Later, as they prepared to leave, Mrs. Jordan hugged Marlon warmly. "You must come back and play for us again," she insisted. "Perhaps when I'm feeling stronger, we can have a proper recital." "I'd like that very much," Marlon replied, hoping her health would indeed improve. On the drive back to Chicago, Marlon sat quietly, processing the emotional day. He had played for many audiences now, teachers, judges, fellow students, but never had his music created such a profound connection as it had today. He had given the Jordan family the gift of music, but they had given him something equally precious: the opportunity to be part of a circle of giving that transcended fame, fortune, and circumstance. The days following Mrs. Jordan's birthday celebration passed in a blur of activity. Marlon received his official acceptance to Juilliard's summer program, complete with a full scholarship and stipend for expenses. Meanwhile, his performances with the Young Musicians program continued to draw notice from Chicago's musical community. "Your playing has matured significantly," Professor Wilson commented after a particularly successful rehearsal. "There's a new depth to your interpretations." Marlon knew the professor was right. Something had shifted in his approach to music since playing for the Jordan family. He found himself thinking less about technical perfection and more about emotional connection, about using music to bridge experiences and memories. One evening, a week before Marlon was scheduled to leave for New York, David called unexpectedly. "Mr. Jordan would like to stop by your apartment tonight, if that's convenient," he said. "Around 8 o'clock. "Of course," Marlon replied, curious about the sudden visit. At precisely 8, a knock came at the door. Elena welcomed Jordan inside. "Sorry for the last-minute visit," Jordan said. "I wanted to catch Marlon before he leaves for Juilliard." "I'll give you two some privacy," Elena said tactfully. retreating to her bedroom. Marlon heard Jordan set something on the coffee table, something that made a light thud. "I brought you something," Jordan explained. "A small gift for your trip to New York." Marlon held out his hands, receiving a package wrapped in simple blue paper. It was rectangular and lightweight. "What is it?" he asked, carefully unwrapping. "There's something I need to tell you," Jordan said, his voice serious. "Something I should have shared earlier." Marlon finished unwrapping the gift, his fingers identifying a plastic cassette case. "Another recording?" "Yes," Jordan confirmed. "But before I explain, I need to tell you the full truth about how I knew your father." Marlon sat perfectly still, sensing the importance of what was coming. "I told you about hearing your father play at the Blue Note," Jordan began, "but I didn't tell you everything about that night." Jordan's voice grew softer, more reflective. "It was during my third season with the Bulls. We'd just lost badly in the playoffs, and critics were saying I could score but couldn't lead a team to a championship." Marlon nodded, remembering those stories from basketball documentaries. "I was in a dark place," Jordan continued, "questioning everything, my future, my abilities, whether all the sacrifice was worth it. That night, I just drove around the city, ended up at that small club on the south side." Jordan described walking into the dimly lit space, finding a corner, table, and ordering a drink. Just another anonymous patron seeking escape. "Then your father started playing," Jordan said. "Something about his music cut straight through all my tangled thoughts. Here was this man, unable to see, creating something so beautiful, so honest. I stayed until closing time, just listening." After the set, I introduced myself, not as a basketball player, just as Michael. We talked for nearly an hour. He mentioned his young son, who was also blind, but showing remarkable musical talent. Jordan paused. "He spoke about you with such pride, Marlon, but also worry, concern about how you'd make your way in a world that isn't designed for people who can't see." "I gave him money to help with your lessons," Jordan admitted. "He was proud, but accepted it because it was for you." Marlon sat speechless, processing this revelation. 2 weeks later, I heard about Ray's tragic accident. "I tried to find your family to help, but I couldn't track you down with the limited information I had." Jordan's voice grew quieter. "For years, I wondered what had happened to you. The boy Ray Thompson had spoken about with such love. Then, by some miracle, I heard you playing in that park. When I heard you mention your father's name weeks later, I couldn't believe it. Everything connected. I knew then that I had to help you fulfill the potential your father had seen." Jordan reached over, gently tapping the cassette tape in Marlon's hands. "This is what I brought you today. The club owner gave me this recording the night I heard your father play. I've kept it all these years." Marlon ran his fingers over the case, reading the Braille label. "Ray Thompson Trio, live at Blue Note, 1997. "This is why you helped me," Marlon said, understanding finally. "At first, yes," Jordan admitted. "I felt I owed it to your father. But then I got to know you, Marlon. You earned every opportunity through your own talent and hard work." Tears welled in Marlon's eyes. "I never knew another recording of him existed." "There's more," Jordan said softly. "That night at the club, your father played a piece he'd composed for you. He called it Marlon's Light. It's the final track on this tape." Marlon clutched the cassette tightly, overwhelmed by emotion. His father had written a piece specifically for him, a musical legacy he'd never known existed. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Marlon asked, not accusingly but curiously. Jordan was thoughtful before answering. At first, I wasn't certain you were Ray's son, just suspected it. Then, when I knew for sure, I wanted you to establish your own identity as a musician, not feel obligated to follow in his footsteps. And I wanted to be sure my help wasn't just about repaying a debt, Jordan continued, that I was supporting you because of who you are, not just because of who your father was. Marlon nodded, understanding. Thank you for telling me now, for keeping this safe all these years. Your father's music changed something fundamental in me that night, Jordan explained. It reminded me why I played basketball, for the pure love of the game, not just for winning. After hearing him play, I returned to training with a different mindset. 2 years later, we won our first championship. They sat in contemplative silence, the tape a tangible connection between past and present, between father and son, between two different artistic journeys. I'd like to hear it, Marlon said finally. Would you listen with me? I'd be honored, Jordan replied. Elena produced an old cassette player, and soon the room filled with the sound of Ray Thompson's trio, piano, bass, and drums recorded. Live at the Blue Note. The sound quality wasn't perfect, but the musicianship was extraordinary. Ray's playing was technically brilliant, yet deeply emotional, complex, yet accessible. As they listened, Marlon felt his father's presence more strongly than he had in years. Each note, each phrase revealed something about the man he'd lost too. Young, his humor, his sensitivity, his resilience. When Marlon's Light began playing, a gentle, hopeful composition that somehow captured the essence of childhood wonder, Marlon felt tears streaming down his face. This was his father's gift to him, preserved all these years by a stranger who became a mentor and friend. He lives on through his music, Jordan said softly, and through you. The weeks leading up to Marlon's departure for Juilliard passed in a whirlwind of preparation and emotion. His father's cassette became his most treasured possession. He listened to it daily, absorbing every nuance of Ray Thompson's playing, connecting with his musical heritage in a profound new way. I can hear where you get your phrasing from, Ms. Rosie observed during their final lesson before his trip. Your father had remarkable sensitivity to dynamic contrast. Marlon beamed at the comparison. I never realized how much my playing resembled his. Now I can hear it too. Before leaving Chicago, Marlon made copies of the cassette with the help of a sound engineering student at the Young Musicians program. The student, Trevor, carefully transferred the aging tape to digital format. This recording is gold, Trevor said enthusiastically. Your dad had serious chops. The audio quality isn't perfect, but the musicianship shines through. Marlon created several digital backups, determined never to lose this precious connection to his father. He loaded the recordings onto his phone so he could listen anytime, anywhere. Take this too, Elena said the night before his departure, pressing something small and metal into his hand. Dad's house key. Marlon identified it immediately by the distinctive notch on one edge. You've kept it all these years? It was in his pocket that night, Elena explained softly. The hospital returned his personal effects. I've saved it, as a reminder that home isn't a place. It's the people we love. Marlon added the key to the chain that held Jordan's lucky stone, creating a talisman of the two men who had shaped his musical journey. The morning of his departure, David arrived, with Jordan to drive them to the airport. Nervous? Jordan asked as they loaded Marlon's luggage. A little, Marlon admitted. 6 weeks is the longest I've ever been away from home. You'll be too busy becoming a better musician to be homesick, Jordan assured him. And New York. has a way of keeping you engaged. At the airport, after checking in, Jordan pulled Marlon aside for a private word. "I wanted to update you on Mom," he said. "The doctors are cautiously optimistic. Her new medication seems to be helping, and they're seeing improvement in her heart function." "That's wonderful news," Marlon exclaimed. "She says your music gives her strength," Jordan told him. "She listens to the recording of your performance every night before bed." Marlon felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm so glad." "Your playing touched something in her," Jordan continued. "In all of us, really. My sister Roslyn, who never cries, was in tears during your original piece. As the boarding announcement came, final hugs were exchanged. Elena held her son tightly, whispering encouragements in his ear. Jordan's embrace was brief but firm. "Call whenever you need anything," Jordan instructed, "day or night." "I will," Marlon promised, "and I'll make you both proud." "You already have," Jordan replied simply. New York proved to be everything Marlon had imagined and more. The Juilliard summer program immersed him in a world of elite music making that challenged and inspired him daily. His instructors pushed him technically while encouraging his emotional expressiveness. Fellow students, initially intimidated by his connection to Michael Jordan, quickly came to respect him for his talent alone. Marlon called home every few days, sharing his experiences with his mother and occasionally with Jordan, who seemed genuinely interested in every detail of his musical growth. "The practice facilities are amazing," Marlon enthused during one call. "And yesterday, a famous concert pianist gave a master class. He used my interpretation of Beethoven as an example of effective emotional communication." Between intense practice sessions and classes, Marlon continued working on his own compositions, inspired by both his father's recordings and the new musical influences surrounding him. He began creating a piece that combined elements of his father's jazz style with classical structures he was studying. "It's like having a conversation with Dad through music," he explained to Jordan during one phone call. "I'll play something in his style, then respond in my own voice." "That's beautiful," Jordan replied. "A dialogue across time." Halfway through the program, Marlon received a surprising email from Professor Wilson. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra was planning a special benefit concert featuring young musicians from diverse backgrounds. Would Marlon consider performing? "It's for a music education initiative," Wilson explained when Marlon called him, "providing instruments and lessons to underserved communities." "When is it?" Marlon asked. 3 weeks after you return from Juilliard. Just enough time to prepare." Marlon immediately accepted, excited by both the opportunity and its purpose. That evening, during his regular call with Jordan, Marlon shared the news. "Wilson mentioned you might be involved with organizing it?" he asked. Jordan chuckled. "Guilty. But the invitation is entirely based on your talent. Wilson has been singing your praises to anyone who'll listen." "I want to perform Full Circle," Marlon decided. "The piece I wrote for your mother, but expanded and refined with what I'm learning here." "Mom will be touched," Jordan said. "She's doing much better now, by the way. The doctors are allowing her to attend small gatherings again." "That's fantastic." News! Before ending the call, Jordan mentioned something that made Marlon's heart skip. "I found some old photos," he said casually, "from that night at the Blue Note. The club photographer took a few shots of your dad at the piano. There's even one with us talking after his set. I'll have copies made for you." Marlon could barely contain his emotion. Photos of his father performing. Tangible visual memories he never thought he'd have. Before returning to Chicago, Marlon completed his new composition, titling it Full Circle. It integrated themes from his father's Marlon's Light, elements from the piece he'd written for Mrs. Jordan, and new musical ideas developed during his time at Juilliard. The composition represented his journey, honoring his past while embracing his evolving musical voice. On his final evening in New York, Marlon stood on the rooftop of the Juilliard dormitory with new friends, feeling the summer breeze against his face as someone described the twinkling city lights spreading out before them. "It's beautiful," he said, though he couldn't see it. In his mind, he transformed the description into music. Bright, staccato notes representing stars against the deep, resonant chords of the city skyline. Tomorrow, he would return to Chicago, carrying new knowledge, new friendships, and a strengthened sense of purpose, ready for the next movement in his unfolding musical journey. 1 year after his first meeting with Jordan in the park, Marlon stood backstage at Chicago's Symphony Hall, his fingers lightly tracing the polished wood of the grand piano he would soon play. The benefit concert for music education, specifically for visually impaired children, had sold out within hours of being announced. 5 minutes, Marlon," the stage manager called softly. Marlon nodded, taking deep breaths to calm his racing heart. This wasn't just any performance. It was the fulfillment of his childhood dream to play in this historic venue. "Nervous?" Jordan's familiar voice approached from his left. "Terrified," Marlon admitted with a small laugh. "But ready? That's the perfect combination," Jordan replied, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. The past year had transformed Marlon's life completely. After his successful summer at Juilliard, he'd returned to Chicago with renewed purpose. The REB Young Musicians program had featured him as a soloist in several concerts, and private donors, many connected to Jordan, had established a scholarship fund in Ray Thompson's name for visually impaired musicians. "Remember when we first met?" Jordan asked, his voice warm with memory. "You told me blind kids from the South Side don't get these chances." Marlon smiled. "I was wrong. We all need someone to believe in us until we learn to believe in ourselves," Jordan said. "Now you'll do that for others." The stage manager returned, clipboard in hand. 2 minutes, Marlon." As Jordan moved to leave, Marlon caught his sleeve. "Will you stay? In the wings?" "Wouldn't miss it," Jordan promised. The concert began with performances by several young musicians from diverse backgrounds. Then the MC announced, "Our featured soloist this evening, pianist Marlon Thompson, performing his original composition, Full Circle." Applause swelled as Marlon walked confidently to the piano, guided by the stage manager's light touch. He adjusted the bench, placed his hands on the keys, and took a moment to center himself. Before beginning, he spoke briefly to the audience. "A little over a year ago, I was playing a public piano in Millennium Park when someone sat down beside me. That chance encounter changed my life forever." Marlon explained the development of Full Circle, how it incorporated his father's musical legacy, his own evolving voice, and the profound connections that had shaped his journey. "This piece honors my father, Ray Thompson, whose musical gift lives on through me. It also celebrates the Thompson-Jordan Musical Education Initiative we're launching tonight, ensuring other young musicians will receive the support they need to develop their talents." As Marlon played the opening notes, he poured every emotion of the past year into the music. The discovery of his father's recording, his growth at Juilliard, the healing power music had brought to Mrs. Jordan, and the circle of giving that had transformed so many lives. The piece moved through contemplative passages that echoed his father's jazz sensibilities, building to an emotionally charged middle section that represented struggle and perseverance. The final movement resolved into a hopeful, forward-looking theme that suggested new beginnings while honoring what came before. When the final notes faded, A moment of profound silence held the hall. Then thunderous applause erupted, the audience rising to their feet in appreciation. Marlon stood and bowed, his heart full. After several curtain calls, he returned to the piano and spoke again. "I'd like to share one more piece tonight," he said, his voice steady despite his emotion. "This is Marlon's Light, composed by my father years ago. Until recently, I never knew it existed. Michael Jordan preserved this musical gift and returned it to me, completing a circle that began long before I understood its significance. The simple, tender composition moved many to tears, its innocent melody capturing a father's love for his son. When Marlon finished, he bowed one final time and exited the stage to renewed applause. In the reception area afterward, Marlon was surrounded by well-wishers, music critics, and potential donors to the new initiative. Mrs. Jordan, now in much improved health, embraced him warmly. "You've helped heal our family," she told him. "Music is powerful medicine." Later, when the crowd had thinned, Jordan found Marlon by the refreshment table. "I couldn't be prouder if you were my own son," he said quietly. They moved to a quieter corner, away from the remaining guests. "There's something I never told you," Jordan said, his voice thoughtful. "Hearing your father play years ago helped me through one of the toughest periods of my career, giving me perspective during a time when basketball had begun to feel more like a burden than a joy." "Really?" Marlon asked, surprised by this new revelation. Jordan nodded. "Your father's music reminded me why I played the game. For love, not just for winning. When things got tough, when critics said I couldn't lead a team to victory, I remembered his performance, playing with such joy, despite his challenges. And that's why you helped me," Marlon realized. "Not out of obligation, but because you understand the power of following your passion." "Exactly," Jordan confirmed. "That's the real secret. Finding what you love and sharing it with the world." The benefit concert raised over $2 million for the new initiative, ensuring music education would reach children who might otherwise never have the opportunity. Plans were already underway for a summer camp specifically designed for visually impaired young musicians, with Marlon slated to serve as a mentor. As the evening concluded, Marlon and Jordan stood in the now empty Symphony Hall, their voices echoing in the vast space. "What's next for you?" Jordan asked. "Juilliard has offered you early admission after high school graduation." Marlon nodded. "I'm going to accept, but I want to keep developing the initiative here too. Maybe split my time between New York and Chicago." "Ambitious," Jordan noted with approval. "But if anyone can do it, you can." As they walked toward the exit, their footsteps synchronized in perfect rhythm, Marlon reflected on the unlikely friendship that had changed everything. How music and basketball, seemingly different paths, had brought them together through the universal language of passion, perseverance, and giving back. The journey that began with a simple question, "You know, fly me to the moon," had blossomed into something neither could have imagined. A legacy that would continue to resonate through countless young musicians for generations to come. Marlon Thompson and Michael Jordan, the blind pianist and the basketball legend, had created a harmony that transcended their differences, proving that the most powerful connections often begin with the simplest acts of kindness. Thanks for listening to The Unexpected Harmony. I hope this story of Marlon and Michael Jordan's journey together touched your heart. Where are you listening from? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this emotional story, please hit that like button and don't forget to check out the video appearing on your screen right now for another heartwarming tale. Your support means the world.